The asphalt of Juniper Lane was a shade of gray that spoke of age, but the houses were immaculate, a row of mid-century brick bungalows and modest ranches that offered the kind of quiet Sergeant First Class Elias Thorne had craved during his 3 tours overseas. After 15 years in the Army, his latest assignment at the nearby regional logistics hub was meant to be his breather. When he signed the closing papers, Elias was meticulous. He checked the deed, the title, and the land surveys. "No HOA, right?" he'd asked the realtor. "None," the woman had replied with a smile. "Just good neighbors and public roads. You're in the clear, Sergeant." But 3 days after the moving truck departed, Elias saw the first sign that something was rotting in the heart of this suburban Eden. The black vests. It was 6 a.m. Elias was on his porch with a thermos of coffee when a black, unmarked SUV crawled down the street. It stopped in front of Mrs. Gable's house, an 80-year-old widow who spent her mornings tending to her prize-winning hydrangeas. 2 men stepped out of the vehicle. They weren't wearing police uniforms, but they were dressed for a conflict. They wore black tactical vests over gray polos. Stenciled across the back in aggressive white block letters were the words, HOA Cop, Enforcement Unit. Elias watched, his combat-trained instincts narrowing his focus. The men approached Mrs. Gable. They didn't smile, they didn't wave. One of them pulled out a digital tablet while the other hovered over the elderly woman, gesturing toward a small patch of clover in her lawn. "That's a Stage 2 biohazard violation, Margaret," the taller one, a man with a buzz cut and a sneer, barked loud enough for Elias to hear. "We talked about this last Tuesday. The fine has doubled. That's $400. Mrs. Gable looked small, her hands trembling as she clutched her gardening shears. I don't have that much until my Social Security check clears on Friday, Mr. Vance." "Late fees apply," the man said, leaning into her personal space. "Or you can pay the convenience settlement now. $200 in cash, and we wipe the record. Otherwise, we start the lien process on the house." Elias watched in stunned silence as the woman reached into her apron, pulled out a wad of folded bills, and handed them over. The HOA cop stuffed the money into his vest pocket, didn't offer a receipt, and walked back to the SUV. The confrontation. Elias spent the next 48 hours doing what he did best, reconnaissance. He spoke to his neighbor, a retired postman named Arthur. "They aren't real art," Elias said, leaning against the fence. "I checked the municipal records. This street isn't even in the Willow Creek HOA boundaries. It's a public thoroughfare." Arthur looked around nervously, his voice a frantic whisper. "It doesn't matter, Elias. They have jurisdiction, because Karen says they do. Karen Holloway. She lives 3 blocks over in the gated section. She says Juniper Lane is a buffer zone, and we have to pay for the security they provide. If you don't pay, they tow your car. They spray paint your garage. They make your life hell." "That's not an HOA," Elias said, his jaw tightening. "That's a protection racket." That afternoon, the black SUV pulled up to Elias's driveway. The man named Vance stepped out, tapping a baton against his thigh. "New guy," Vance said. "You're behind on your neighborhood integration fee. $500. Plus, your truck is parked at an unsightly angle. That's another $50. Elias didn't move. He stood on his driveway like a stone wall. "I'm not in an HOA. This is a public street. Get off my property." Vance laughed, a dry, grating sound. "Everyone pays, Sergeant. We know your rank. We know where you work. Don't be a hero. Tell you what, you seem like a guy who understands how the world works. Keep your mouth shut, tell the others to keep paying, and I'll put you on the exempt list. Heck, I'll even throw you $100 a month for the trouble." "You're offering me a bribe to help you rob senior citizens?" Elias asked. "I'm offering you a quiet life," Vance corrected. "Get off my property," Elias repeated, "before I decide to start a training exercise on your face." The Queen in the gated castle. Elias didn't wait for them to come back. He drove to the Willow Creek main office, a lavish, glass-fronted building that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a neighborhood association office. Karen Holloway sat behind a mahogany desk. She was a woman who radiated a terrifying sense of self-importance, her hair sprayed into a rigid bob, her neck draped in pearls that looked like they cost more than Elias's truck. "Mr. Thorne," she said, not looking up from her paperwork. "I heard you were difficult. It's a shame. We value order here." "You're extorting people outside your boundaries, Karen," Elias said, placing his hands flat on her desk. "I've seen the maps. Juniper Lane isn't yours. You're stealing from retirees." Karen finally looked up. Her eyes were as cold as a mountain lake. Influence doesn't stop at a line on a map, Sergeant. I provide a service. I keep the riffraff out. The people on Juniper Lane pay for the privilege of living near my community. If you disrupt that flow, you'll find that the riffraff starts targeting your house specifically. My boys can be very thorough. Is that a threat?
It's a forecast, Karen smiled.
The weather on Juniper Lane is about to get very stormy for you.
The ambush.
1 week later, the storm arrived. Elias was in his garage, cleaning his mountain bike, when the black SUV screeched into his driveway, blocking his exit. Vance and another enforcer, a massive man with a thick beard and scarred knuckles, stepped out. They weren't carrying tablets this time. They were carrying zip ties and heavy-duty flashlights. Last chance, Thorne, Vance growled, stepping into the garage. Sign the HOA joinder agreement and pay the $3,000 aggravated non-compliance fine, or we're taking you in for citizens' detention. You're trespassing, Elias said, his voice dropping into the low, calm register he used right before a breach.
Leave now.
The bearded man lunged first, reaching for Elias's throat.
It was a mistake.
In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of the hidden cameras Elias had installed 4 days prior, it was a clear case of unprovoked assault. Elias moved with the economy of motion that only decades of hand-to-hand combat training can produce. He parried the bearded man's reach, used the man's own momentum to drive him into the brick wall of the garage, and delivered a sharp strike to the brachial plexus. The man folded like a card table. Vance pulled a collapsible baton and swung. Elias stepped inside the arc of the swing, blocked the forearm, and executed a sweeping takedown. As Vance hit the concrete, Elias transitioned into a joint lock that ended with a sickening pop.
Stay down, Elias commanded.
Outside, neighbors had gathered, drawn by the shouting. They weren't hiding this time. They were holding up their phones, recording every second. When the real police arrived, the actual county sheriff's deputies, they didn't find a brawl.
They found a crime scene.
Elias stood with his hands visible, his military ID on the hood of his truck, while 2 enforcers lay groaning on his garage floor. The collapse of an empire. The investigation that followed was like pulling a loose thread on a cheap sweater. The sheriff's department, initially skeptical of HOA drama, changed their tune when they saw the HOA cop vests and the cash stashed in the SUV. They executed a search warrant on Karen Holloway's office and home. What they found was a blueprint for a criminal enterprise. Karen hadn't just been overzealous. She had created a shadow government. She had a ledger, a physical and digital black book, detailing the $323,000 she had squeezed out of non-HOA residents over the last 24 months. She had used the money to fund a lifestyle of luxury cruises, designer handbags, and consulting fees paid to her husband's shell companies. The HOA cops weren't security guards. They were ex-cons and disgraced former mall security hired specifically for their ability to intimidate the elderly. The trial was a media sensation. Karen Holloway, once the queen of Willow Creek, wept as elderly victims, people she had called neighbors, testified about the terror she had inflicted on them. Mrs. Gable stood on the stand and told the court how she had skipped her heart medication for 2 months just to pay a fine for her hydrangeas. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The sentences. Karen Holloway, convicted of 42 counts, including racketeering, RICO, elder financial abuse, and felony extortion. Sentenced to 24 years in state prison. The judge ordered a permanent fiduciary bar, meaning she can never hold a position of authority over any organization's finances again. Vance, sentenced to 11 years for aggravated assault, impersonating a peace officer, and extortion. The second enforcer, sentenced to 8 years for conspiracy and trespass.
Peace restored.
The Willow Creek HOA didn't survive the scandal. A class action lawsuit filed by the residents, both inside and outside the boundaries, resulted in the total dissolution of the organization. The lavish office building was sold at auction, and the proceeds were used to pay back every cent, with interest, to the victims. Juniper Lane went back to being a quiet street. A year later, Elias Thorne sat on his porch, his truck parked at whatever unsightly angle he felt like. Mrs. Gable walked by, her hydrangeas looking better than ever. She stopped and handed Elias a plate of warm cookies. "The clover is coming back in my yard," she said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Let it grow, Margaret," Elias smiled. "It's a free country." In the end, it wasn't the military training or the cameras that saved the neighborhood. It was the moment someone finally stopped asking, "How much do I owe you?" and started saying no. The shadow of the HOA cop was gone, replaced by the simple, quiet dignity of a man who knew his rights and a neighborhood that had found its voice.